Following the arrival of the guajira to Spain from Cuba and due to its huge popularity in the country, new variants of guajira began to emerge, among them the so-called guajiras Vida. In episode 39 of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco, I will talk about this guajira, we will review if there was any precedent in Cuba, and we will hear some musical samples and recordings so you can enjoy this guajira.
Sounds that once were listened. Sounds that once were enjoyed. Sounds that once were danced. Sounds relegated to oblivion. And yet, there is still something we can do for them. Let us summon them. Let us summon them.
Welcome to the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. My name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo, and I invite you to enroll in this journey through the sounds, stories, spaces, and people that were part of the 19th century flamenco.
Hello, and thank you very much for being there and listening to this new podcast episode. If you don't know, you can find the previous 38 episodes on the leading podcast platforms or the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados, Etnomusicologia Creativa. As we saw in episode 5 of this podcast, we have news of the guajira in Spain from 1878. As we also saw in episode 13, it quickly became a fashionable song in Spain, especially in Córdoba, and began to form part of the repertoire of people who sang, played, or danced flamenco. As a result of this popularity, various guajira copla melodies began to appear, and some of them became very popular and known by almost everyone in Spain. As you know, in this podcast, we love to approach everyday microhistories and avoid staying only with generalities, and today's episode is an example of this. We will learn about one of the most popular guajira couplets of the last years of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century. I am referring to those known as guajiras Vida Mía. I researched this type of guajira in depth in my doctoral thesis at UNAM, and I will tell you about some of the results I obtained from the research. This guajira was named this way because it contains the verse Vida Mía, interspersed several times between the other verses of the stanza. The oldest musical reference I can find for this guajira is contained in the Zarzuela Boda, Tragedia y Guateque o el Difunto de Chuchota, composed by Pedro Miguel Marqués, 1843-1918. This zarzuela is a picture of Cuban customs whose plot takes place in Villa Clara, Cuba, in 1865. It premiered at the Teatro Eslava in Madrid on January 9, 1894, with a resounding success. The press of the time thus highlighted the duet in which the guajira appears, sung by Lucrecia Arana and José Ripoll. They both form a good couple, at least when singing, and the reason for this can be understood, knowing that she is Miss Arana. He is Mr. Ripoll, who marries very well when performing a beautiful duet, which last night caused true enthusiasm in the audience that completely filled the theater. I have already mentioned the famous duet between the soprano and Mr. Ripoll, but I must insist on mentioning it again because it is a superb musical piece. The audience cheered the two artists and the maestro Marqués, present in the stage box, with very lively demonstrations. Another chronicle published the next day in the press also highlights the tremendous success of this work. In it, the critic considers the guajira a musical jewel. The romance of the first scene and the third duet are two musical gems that captivated the audience and earned the maestro a persistent call to the stage. In short, and as we said at the beginning of these lines, although part of the public, as was seen from the moment the curtain was raised, was predisposed to the failure of Boda, Tragedia y Guateque, the farce pleased the vast majority, who made the authors come to the conclusion 6 or 8 consecutive times. A couple of months later, this work also triumphed in Barcelona, where it was announced as a new lyrical farce of excellent success. So before continuing, let's see how this guajira Vida Mía sounded, which had such a resounding success after its premiere in 1894. Let's listen to the composition by Pedro Miguel Marqués. We are curious to know if this work was based on a guajira that was already popular at the time or if it happened the other way around. Given the success of this work, people began to sing it. The fact is that years later, I found this guajira sung and recorded quite frequently by flamenco artists in the first decade of the 20th century, although it is no longer sung today. In these recordings, a transformation can be perceived in terms of the stanza used in the couplets, going from using a tenth to a quartet, although the verse Vida Mía will be kept. Antonio Pozo, El Mochuelo, was one of the flamenco singers who recorded and sold the most records in the first decade of the 20th century. He sang this guajira regularly and recorded it for various record companies. Let's listen to this guajira in the voice of El Mochuelo in a wax cylinder recording kept in the Vicente Marias Segarra Museum of Telecommunications History. Although the quality of the recording is not very good, you can hear that the melody is practically the same as the one we heard earlier in the Zarzuela piece. Another flamenco artist who performed this guajira was Antonio Ortega Escalona Juan Breva, one of the most popular and famous flamenco singers of the last quarter of the 19th century. In 1910, he made a series of phonographic recordings, including a guajira, whose previous verse he sings is Vida Mía. He used to include them in his repertoire according to the information I found in the press, such as this news item from 1895. Juan Breva, the famous Andalusian singer who for many years delighted the flamenco people of Seville, gave us last night, accompanied by Piquili, an excellent nickname, and the renowned guitarist Juan Zarita, a pleasant session of Cante Jondo, in the courtyard of the casino. The audience was very pleased with Juan Breva's style, who sings guajiras and malagueñas with a meaningful accent. Another singer who performs and records this guajira is Manuel Reina, El Canario Chico. Reina not only limited himself to flamenco art but also sang lyrical repertoire and used to perform guajiras regularly, according to the chronicles of some of his performances. Teatro Principal, having been proposed to the famous Andalusian singer Manuel Reina, Canario Chico, by several admirers of our countryman José Sánchez, Marmalista, a competition between the two. The first has accepted, with the condition that each one has to accompany himself with his guitar. This competition will take place tonight at the Teatro Principal, singing malagueñas of various styles, murcianas, cartageneras, guajiras, granadinas, almerenses, and many other songs that will please the public. I also find this guajira couplet in several scores from this period, whose titles almost always contain qualifiers such as popular or famous. Let's listen to some of them, specifically the Guajiras Populares by Luis Foglietti, which date back to 1905. As I said, this guajira was very famous in those years, and the melodic motifs of this couplet were used by some composers in orchestral works, such as in Tres Piezas de Concerto Opus 6, N2 Guajiras by Enrique Fernández Arbós, or the Guajiras N1 Danza Cubana, by the Galician violinist Manuel Quiroga Losada, both for violin and orchestra or cubana included in Cuatro Canciones Españolas by Manuel de Falla, which includes the motif of this guajira at the beginning of this work in this way. Sometimes, with some Spanish guajiras, we find that they share music or lyrics with other earlier Cuban pieces. Although I have not yet found any music similar to that of this guajira in Cuba, there may be a precedent in the lyrics. Note that Antonio Erizos published in 1929 that during the War of 1868, The decimos were used by the insurgent movement to express their feelings of freedom. The desk virulent was repeated from mouth to mouth in the brief leisure time of the war. Among these decimos he includes the verse Vida mía. Roa's decimos were very famous. During the War of 68, Vida mía, real echo of the jungle inflamed by rebellion. He transcribes 5 decimos with a very similar last verse, always ending in Vida mía. The first of these verses, entitled precisely Vida mía, is the following. When the patriotic soldier, as soon as night comes, gives himself over to pleasant sleep, overwhelmed by fatigue, I, besieged by sleeplessness, on a dark and cold night, so silent and somber, raise my complaint to heaven, and in the light of each star, I think of you, my life. The only musical reference that I have found that could have some relation to this verse is a recording by El Moquelo entitled Al Amanecer al Día, which refers to the Cuban troops and ends precisely with this verse. I think of you, my life. In this case, his verse does not musically resemble the others in Vida Mía. When I analyzed the musical structures of the pieces and recordings I could obtain of this type of guajira from that period, I found that all the works had quite similar structures. We are talking about very different works belonging to zarzuela, salon music, and recordings by flamenco artists over more than 20 years. With this analysis, I could confirm that the transformation between Marques's work and the later ones to adapt the singing from a stanza of 10 verses to another of 4 did not imply significant structural changes. Therefore, this again calls into question the barrier that has been attempted to be imposed between academic and popular music. The musical instruments, the vocal technique, and the musical occasion could change, but what was maintained was the structure of the music itself so that all the versions continued to be recognizable by the people who heard them. Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode dedicated to a guajira that, although it was trendy once, is no longer sung in flamenco today. Remember that you can follow us on social media or by subscribing to the podcast on the leading podcast platforms or the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados. Etnomusicologia Creativa. Thank you very much, and see you in the next episode.